Now I do it downstairs when nobody's home.
So they had a good view of all the bottles at least.
Yeah, yeah, you know, I should have offered to have
you could read the labels.
Yeah.
Terrific. All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. I assume people can also trickle in once we've gotten started. So this is the first of two for this semester of our AJHI public writing workshop. This was something that really was grassroots. It bubbled up out of interest from faculty and graduate students who for some time now have been talking about the importance of developing the skills that we need to get our ideas out into the general public. And I think beyond that, talking as well about how important the same skills are for cultivating our own ability to articulate our ideas better, to circulate them better within the more confined communities that form our academic homes as well. So this is something that those of us here on the screen have been passionate about for some time. We're all approaching it in different ways in our own work. It's been and I'm going to say it here is the broader goal, the broader idea of a public-oriented humanistic practice has been at the core of the AJHI's mission for some time, actually from its inception 5 years ago. So this is the latest installment in that, something that my colleagues Becker Seguin and Joseph Plaster have been very much at the forefront of working on within AJHI, Anand Pandian as well. It led to the creation of Humanities in the Village several years ago, which has been our kind of marquee public facing series that takes place when it takes place physically at all, when it used to take place physically in Charles Village, hence Humanities in the Village, but it has made a very successful transition to online as well. So this is going to be a bit more intimate. This is conceived of as a conversation with colleagues here at the university that we know and already knew about as being practitioners of a very high level of public writing. And the idea behind this was to ask, and today Joseph will introduce Jeanne-Marie Jackson in a moment, but to ask each of these colleagues as they join us to give us an example of academic writing and an example of more public-oriented writing, for us to have a chance to read, compare, think about, and then ask questions about the choices that go into those different formats, those different platforms. So without further ado, I'm going to pass this over to Joseph, who is really the organizing force behind this particular workshop. And so Joseph, why don't you take it over now?
Yeah, thanks so much. So I'll tell you all just a little bit about the format of this event and briefly introduce Jeanne-Marie Jackson, who is an assistant professor in the Department of English at Johns Hopkins. Her work addresses questions of comparative method, literature, and philosophy, mainly in the framework of African literature and intellectual history. She's published quite a few academic books, the first one being South African Literature's Russian Soul, Narrative Forms of Global Isolation. The second is The African Novel of Ideas, which reads African novels through the lens of African philosophy. And the third is a book she's working on with Routledge, which maybe we can also take up as part of the conversation. It's called Anglophone African Literature, 21st Century Perspectives, and that's going to be the first classroom guide to African writing from the turn of the century to the present. And aside from academic books and essays, she's written for a number of public-facing venues like N1, 3 AM magazine, public books. My favorite is Book Slut, which I would love to hear about. And in organizing this event, we asked Jeanne-Marie for two pieces of her writing, one that's quote unquote academic, one that's written for popular audiences, both on similar themes. And what we want to do today as a group is to discuss those essays that she shared with us. So that's the N1 essay, N+1 essay on Zimbabwean writing. That's the popular writing piece. And then an academic essay from the novel, the journal Novel. But before moving into that discussion, we wanted to start out by asking her for some background on how those pieces came about and just her thoughts on the process of writing for public audiences. So I'll hand it over to Jeanne-Marie now. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks. And thank you for inviting me. It's an honor and a pleasure to be, I guess, the inaugural speaker for this event, which I think is a very worthy one. Obviously, it's a topic of almost constant consideration, I think, for those of us who are especially in the younger part of our profession, where it's not always quite clear what role public writing plays in how we're evaluated and in the careers that we're building. So it's something that I've had to navigate over the past few years myself. These particular pieces came out of a really weird time, I think, in an academic career, which is when you're moving from the first book to the second book, first book to the second academic book, I mean. So I had written a first monograph on Russian and South African literature that grew, as academic books tend to do, out of my dissertation. I had done a doctorate in comparative literature. So it was a bit of a weird topic, as a lot of comparative topics are. And then I was truly living between the northeastern US and South Africa for about 5 years, had homes in both places and had spent quite a bit of time in Zimbabwe in that period, working on language skills, mainly a language called Shona. Chishona, which is the main spoken language in Zimbabwe, other than English. And then the second one would be Indebele, because they get mentioned in the N+1 piece. But I didn't yet know how this passion is really what it was. I just absolutely fell in love with the language and this place, how it connected to my larger research trajectory yet. I hadn't started writing the second book in earnest. I was really sort of groping towards it. So the academic piece that I provided for this from Novel, which is kind of one of the main literary journals focused on the novel, it is what it sounds like, subtitle is A Forum on Fiction, was really my effort to figure out what the stakes of Zimbabwean writing specifically, so a lesser known tradition even than South African, certainly than Nigerian on a world stage, what the stakes were for these big disciplinary conversations that we tend to be, I think, really concerned with, especially at Hopkins, because our departments are so small. So you don't have what could be considered a luxury, depending on your vantage point, or a liability of kind of ducking out into your subspecialization here in the way that you might in a bigger department. And I wanted to try to put the history of Zimbabwean long form prose in conversation with these kind of grand discussions in post-colonial theory, for example, and thinking about the form of the novel, afterlives of structuralism, those sorts of things. That kind of topic is not what you write about usually in a public intellectual venue. To some degree, you can kind of bring it in and reference it, but whether or not people have misunderstood structuralist methodology is not, for the most part, what I imagine writers of N+1 or of public books or whatever to be interested in, and I think for perfectly good reason. So the second piece, the public piece for N+1, was really more about trying to tell the story of Zimbabwean writing as it was relevant to, I think, really contemporary issues surrounding social media and surrounding the sort of internalization of new media communicative norms in high literary work. And trying to figure out why that was both a blessing and a curse, why a reader of everything potentially, which is who you're addressing with a magazine like N+1, people who can buy whatever, right, from any tradition, why they should be picking up specifically a 400-page novel, debut novel, I should say, by a young Zimbabwean writer. And I felt really strongly that they should be. So that kind of writing was much more about being something of a go-between, I guess, between a tradition that I had spent some years quite immersed in and very committed to, and a broader American audience who wasn't necessarily going to see these books reviewed as they had been in African and to some degree UK-based publications. I should say that I had written for N+1 quite a bit before this essay. I've written for them probably half a dozen times, something like that. I had a really good relationship with their then editor, a guy named Nikhil Saval, who is now actually a state rep in Pennsylvania. And I also knew that it was going to be a venue where I would get really intense, oftentimes pretty difficult to swallow editorial direction. And so there was a real use value, you might say, to me, and I think to anyone who's writing for that kind of publication in terms of what you can bring back to your academic writing. And I knew that I wanted my second monograph, my second sort of academic book, to be a little more, I really dislike the word accessible, it's used so often, but to be something that I wanted my husband, who's a physician, but knows African literary traditions fairly well. I wanted him to be able to read it and actually get something out of it. So that was my goal. In terms of the broader concerns about writing for public venues, I think the first thing to say is that its blessings are often its curses. And the first thing that should be at the forefront of one's mind, I think, when writing for me, it's been N+1, Public Books, 3 AM. Bookslut was like a pretty major publication back in the day. It was one of the first big internet-only literary magazines founded by a woman named Jessa Crispin, hugely popular for a good run, about 10 years, is now no longer being updated. But is that you're going for timeliness, relevance, edge, right? I mean, something to grab your reader into caring about this material when faced with this massive realm of possible material. So you're speaking to a moment. And I think that that is both a good thing and a bad thing. It's something that has potential to connect you with a wider range of interlocutors than you might be connected with working in an academic specialty or subspecialty even. And I love that about it. I made sort of far-reaching contacts in doing this kind of work, in Nigeria, in Europe, people I'm still in touch with and have been really formative points of conversation for me. At the same time, sometimes I look back at pieces that I spent just huge amounts of energy workshopping and editing and getting out there that had a shelf life of a couple months at the outset. I mean, if I'm being generous to myself. And so I think that's something that we're always trading off between in public writing, is what is really worth the time commitment to make it a good piece that's maybe going to have some staying power. How many of these do you want to be doing a year if you are also working on academic work? It becomes not just an issue of where you focus your energies, but also a practical concern for how you're managing your career. So I think that that is an important thing to discuss. The second blessing and curse, I think now, and this wasn't necessarily so much the case when I started writing public literary criticism. I was a grad student, so like 2010, 2009, probably. I was first publishing in Bookslut and TLR, the Literary Review. Is that you can't avoid social media when you're getting these pieces out there, unless you're going with a venue, as I ended up doing, that has a big enough presence that they can kind of do it for you. But there's this huge temptation to sort of track your pieces, to track your work as it moves around Twitter and Facebook, but especially Twitter. And that comes with its own set of challenges. So I will say with some frankness that I have a lot of anxiety issues. I think probably a lot of academics do. I've worked very hard to manage them over the years. And Twitter for me was hugely challenging for that reason. I've had 3 different accounts. I now don't have one and haven't for some months. I remember I think I had a lot of followers at one point, probably 1,000. Well, I guess that's not a lot. For me, it seemed like a lot. But back when I was first writing publicly, and all 3 times I just couldn't do it. Being on Twitter takes a physical toll on me even. And I think as we've headed into a more fraught political and social time, for obvious and manifold reasons, social media has kind of heated up accordingly. And so it can be difficult, I think, for some people, depending on your own issues and your own state of being, to know how to navigate that. But I do think it's something that deserves real discussion, because especially when we're in graduate school, which can be a difficult time anyway in terms of mental health and time management, that is something that really factors in. So in closing, I will say that what I have found is the best sort of balance for me is to have reined in my public writing a little bit. At my peak a few years ago, I was probably writing 4 or 5 pieces a year, essays, reviews, occasionally commentary. I was part of an N+1 forum on academic labor. Trying to think what else. Way back, wrote a piece on the kind of various Charlie Hebdo and pen scandals that was pretty widely circulated, and that I'm not sure I'd write now. But I have become much more selective about where and when I do this kind of work. And it's really for personal reasons. Like I said, where do I want to invite the sort of vulnerability that public engagement, I think, now represents? And where do I think that my particular skill set, quote Liam Neeson from Taken, classic art film that I'm sure we all know, but where can my particular background and skill set really add something that isn't going to be added by 10,000 other people? I think that the public sphere is so nicheified and so huge and so variable that most things you can think of to write about are going to be covered and then some, right? I mean, you get these sort of effects where you have literally thousands of think pieces on really hot topics. And you get caught up in these kind of swirling debates for a day or 5 days or maybe a week. And I think for what I do, that's not really where, not just where I want to be, but it's frankly not where I can actually contribute anything. And so I think, okay, I can contribute something by being the person that a handful of US-based publications know can come up with something on oftentimes independent, published, really innovative, achieved African fiction. And so I think I've been really lucky to be able to bring some books that a lot of readers here otherwise genuinely wouldn't have heard about to a US audience. Books that are oftentimes only published on the continent. You know, as a reviewer here, you can have, and I have had some small modest role in bringing them to the international visibility that then results in, say, a book contract. I'm not by any means taking credit for anyone's contract, but you know, you need all hands on deck really for getting that kind of information out there. And so that to me seems like a really worthwhile place to devote my energies. And I think that that is a different type of writing and a different type of public intellectual career than, say, doing commentary. Or yeah, these sort of, I hear them called think pieces a lot, you know, sort of para-political kind of stuff. And I have opinions, but I don't know, frankly, how valuable they are really on those sorts of issues. So I think I, in some, have sort of self-curated over the past few years in a way that I didn't used to do necessarily to such an extent. And for me, it's felt like a more limited, but I think more fruitful and more focused way of navigating these increasingly tricky, kind of choppy public discussive waters. And I'd be happy to talk more about picking and choosing one's projects, picking and choosing one's deadlines and editors if people are interested in that. But I think that gives you a pretty good sense of where I'm coming from.
Wonderful, Jeanne-Marie. And first of all, let me just begin by thanking Jeanne-Marie for unsurprisingly kicking us off with her characteristic eloquence and insightfulness, and really getting exactly to the point that we want to get at in this in this conversation. Beckett and Joseph, I have a question that I can start us off with, if that's fine with you all, and then we'll keep our eyes. I guess we'll all keep our eyes on the chat bar for questions coming in from the audience as well. But Jeanne-Marie, first of all, I loved how you framed this. I love how you got around to the very important Liam Neeson quote of what my particular skill set is and how can I best use it. I like how you characterize yours, and I think that's a great kind of principle for curating, as you said, then the kind of contributions that you're making to the public sphere. What I was curious about is this distinction. It came out on my notepad here as a question, or a distinction between the question of how you write and where you publish. Because a lot of the conversation that you got us into, which I think very appropriately, is about the where part of it, but it began with the question of the why. And the question that I have, and there were a couple of quotes that jumped out at me. You made this point that, well, maybe in the sorts of questions that you're approaching, and we can bring as sort of fodder for this conversation, the two pieces that you've given us, but maybe that the sorts of inside baseball, if you will, questions that you're approaching in the piece in novel are, as you said, for good reasons, not necessarily of interest to the general public. That was one point that you made. And then you made another point that the piece for N+1, or as you started writing for N1, you got used to, or you benefited from, intense editorial attention, that you were able to bring these skills back to your writing. And what this sort of raised was a kind of two-sided question. If we can say, and all of us nodding and understanding what you mean, that the sorts of questions or the sorts of concerns that might come up in the piece in novel, for good reason, aren't necessarily the same concerns that are going to be of interest to a broader audience. And at the same time, the writing skills that we're developing by writing for the broader audience are writing skills that are useful, important, helpful for the other kind of writing. To what extent is maintaining a kind of firewall between these practices even a healthy thing for us? Yeah. Right? Yeah. I'm just wondering to what extent we might want to actually, insofar as we're implicitly accepting that there's a kind of, at least the way that you've presented, and we all, I think, agree, there's a certain real value, not just kind of surface value, but real value. Again, I'm not talking about the where and the shelf life and how long it's staying, but the actual skills and questions and way of unpacking questions that come from, this serious, intense editorial attention that you're getting in the public sphere, the kinds of ways of maybe presenting questions, that all of this may be something that, I don't know, to put it provocatively, that we're shirking by when we're failing to pay attention to those questions in our more academic writing.
Yeah. So first of all, I do think, and I hope this doesn't sound pedantic, but for me, there's a big difference between being a first academic book author and being a second academic book author in terms of the degree to which this type of writing kind of is mutually inflective, right? Has a porous relationship. And that's because partially I was trained as a comparatist, as I mentioned, and that is a key detail because what you are expected to do in a comparative project, I think, is quite different than what you're expected to do when the tradition that you're working in is to some degree a given. So the question of discipline as a comparatist becomes really, really crucial, not just as boundary drawing, right? I mean, and the sort of thing we need to transcend, although certainly I understand cases for interdisciplinarity or transdisciplinarity, but you are actually saying, okay, what is the object that I'm working with here, just from the most basic level? If I want to have Russia and, sort of Afrikaans writers in conversation, just what do I need to go find at the library? I mean, it's not by any means straightforward or self-evident when you're doing that. And we've got a bunch of languages in the mix. And those are skills that I just don't know translate to a public medium in the same way that the kinds of skills that I was marshaling writing my second book actually do. And I have to say, I think for any graduate students who may be tuning in, that I'm very, very glad that I had the experience of writing a true sort of hardcore comparatist first book where thinking about the meaning of discipline and precisely where we want to be erecting and taking down boundaries between language traditions was important. So it's not something that I would have wanted to give up to jump right to, the kind of more readily available crossover that I had in my second go at writing an academic book, where I was constantly moving between a public forum and the academic one. That said, I do think that there's a real problem, just practically speaking, with the lack of editorial attention that we often get as academics. I am an editor myself, so I'm guilty of this, but I read it for Modernism, Modernity. I edited a series called Field Reports, which is kind of a public academic crossover. You might call it a para-academic space, available for free on the Modernism, Modernity website, where we do like 2,500 word pieces about emplaced sort of concrete modernist artistic experiments and literary experiments. And I know how much time it takes to give it really serious editorial attention on the one hand. And I also know how incredibly prickly, and again, I implicate myself in this, academics can be about having their prose touched, right? Or tampered with. And it can be very personal very quickly. It's a whole mess, particularly when you're crossing rank as a junior scholar, editing a senior scholar. You've got to be especially careful, maybe. But writing for a magazine with a pretty wide circulation, that's just not even an issue. I remember when I first started writing for TLR, the Literary Review, again, years back, 2009, 2010, something like that. I was so mad at having my prose touched by this editor. And I was like, how dare she, right? Like, I'm in this fancy PhD program. And I look back at it and I think, my God, what an idiot I was. Like, she was making my writing so much better. And it wasn't until I was writing with some frequency for N+1, where Nikhil, who had actually been a literature PhD himself, said, we're not going to be precious about it, right? I just went through and just tore my stuff apart, that I kind of learned to be edited and learned to actually welcome being edited. And then very, very slowly started to self-edit in a much more productive way. And now I can do it pretty well. I can sit down with a piece and clear it out, over a few hours, but that took me 5-6 years to get to where I felt that I could do that with any degree of efficacy. So I suppose I've reformulated your question as much as I've answered it, simply by saying that we have practical skills, I think, on both ends of the public versus scholarly writing spectrum, one of which is disciplinary archive construction, as I said, coming from a comparatist background especially, and the other of which is just sort of nuts and bolts editorial prose workshopping. But what I would like to see is full appreciation and moving between both of those skill sets, rather than necessarily feeling like we have to efface the difference between the types of writing in order to put them into conversation. So for me, it's extremely important, especially working in African literature, that there is a genuinely scholarly space for this, because I think it's often taken up as trendy now, right? I mean, African literature is having a moment of cool. People like Chimamanda Adichie, or they read Homegoing, and that's great. I'm so happy when people are interested in traditions they may not have been otherwise. But there is also a many decades, and depending on who you talk to, centuries long set of traditions that do require extremely careful language work, extremely careful parsing of concepts like race, which are very easy to inject into a public conversation, but don't necessarily have justice done to them without the full weight of a scholarly apparatus, I think. So I want both. I hope that answers your question, at least to some degree.
So Jeanne-Marie, I wanted to ask you a little bit about, or taking you back to your initial adventures in public writing. And so what were some of the assumptions that you kind of came into public writing having? I mean, you mentioned a few of them, but how did those academic assumptions get kind of overturned, or what other academic assumptions have you seen from the professorial side about public writing that you think, again, having 10 years of experience in this, you think need to be overcome or would be better for graduate students and professors to understand before they get into public writing?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. I think first of all, I assumed people had a lot more knowledge of the stuff I was into than they did. And I want to be clear that that was my mistake, not theirs. When I read one of your fantastic pieces, Becker, or friends of mine who are working from, I've got a lot of friends who are South Asianists, for example, who do crossover stuff, or friends of mine from grad school who are JDs and they're writing for sort of public legal blogs. I am so grateful for them taking a paragraph or two at the outset and giving me what to them would seem like basic information about where they're coming from. And I think that when I first started writing publicly, I would get prickly about that, kind of like, oh, I'm not going to simplify, the history of South Africa. And that's just, it's ridiculous, frankly, right? When you're writing for an audience of whom you shouldn't assume any foreknowledge because they have different foreknowledges. And so now I'm more willing to write in a way that to me might feel basic, isn't the right, a way that is what I would want from someone writing about something that's unfamiliar to me. Now the risk of that, and I think this is where the social media stuff comes in, is that you can never please anyone. So I'll give you a concrete example. I wrote a piece some years ago, the quarantine has just completely muddled my timeline, but probably 3 years ago for The Conversation Africa. And it ended up being, for me, kind of a viral piece. I mean, not for anyone who's actually like an influencer or whatever, but by my standards. So it got picked up by a lot of other venues and was very, very widely shared in certain networks on Twitter. And a lot of African readers were sharing it. So not academics, but people who just are really, really, really into African fiction, which has such a life on the continent in a network of literary festivals and things like that. And I was so gratified by it, that they were really getting something from it because it was about what we miss when we think of transnational African writing as only being part of these big publishing houses, often called the Big Seven, and what sorts of small press fiction was doing in a way that might be distinct or riskier, formally speaking. And of course, then I stayed on Twitter too long. This is why I'm not there anymore. And I see this guy who I kind of know, not well, but an academic. And I later found out it was called subtweeting. He's like, oh, this piece you all love, God, it's so mediocre and basic. Any scholar knows that, and just went after it. And I was so crestfallen because I thought, but that's what I was supposed to do. It wasn't supposed to be a dissertation or a novel essay or whatever. And I think I got scared. And for a while, then I tried to go back to raising a certain bar of complexity right off the bat, from sentence one. And in retrospect, I should have just been like, you can't please all parties with every piece of writing. And at the end of the day, you are better off explaining too much than you are not explaining enough and losing readers who might otherwise be really interested and engaged. And I think you see that those of you who did get a chance to read this N+1 piece, the N+1 audience is incredibly well read and incredibly cosmopolitan, but probably don't read a lot of Zimbabwean novels. And so I took the time to walk them through that and say, hey, here's a quick history. Here's why books that you may soon be hearing about actually matter, not just in this grand transnational context, but thinking about traditions that go back to the 70s and 80s on the continent. So that's one thing.
Just to follow up on that, especially that N+1 piece, what was fascinating to me about how you open that piece, especially the first kind of 2 sections, right, is that unlike in a lot of public writing where you have like a kind of anecdotal introduction or you really put people like in place, right, you managed to kind of put all of your kind of scholarly chops on the table, right, for everyone to see it. Like you give like this beautiful history of the past, 25, 30, 40, 50 years, right, of Zimbabwean fiction, right? And yet it's still, for a reader, right, it's still kind of entertaining and you still kind of stick with it, right? But yet that's often challenging when you're trying to use your kind of scholarly background and yet channel that through a kind of public voiced. So how do you, what are the, let's say, challenges that you've had with that, and what strategies have you thought of to, or have you used to kind of marry those two parts of yourself, right? Your kind of scholarly, very informed, or kind of reservoir of knowledge with this kind of, you need to entertain or at least keep the attention of your reader.
Yeah, well, just right. People are, I totally get it. It's very hard to sustain attention these days, especially on a long form public piece. We're all so conditioned to doom scroll or whatever they're calling it. So I try to be attentive, first of all, to what would hold my attention. But I think more to your point, there is a process for me of moving when I've been really, really heated up in academic writing. I just finished a piece on notions of objectivity in the Gold Coast in the 19th, moving into the 20th century. And I was thinking about how I would translate it, to someone who isn't that invested in Gold Coast intellectual histories. And it's about going back to your primary texts and sort of telling a story, right? Why should anybody care about this? Why should, and Zimbabwean readers who are dealing every day with trying to stay on top of all of their governmental malfeasance, why should they take their time to read, this random white American writer's take on their literature? And it's because you have to be telling a story that has its own guts, that you feel like it would tell itself if only it could. And so I'm just going to bring it out and kind of bring it to the surface. And it's so not about me. It's about kind of giving it this air, giving it the open continuity that you can sort of sense is under there. And for me, trying to be a little bit less abstract about it, it's about dropping, oftentimes it's extremely deliberate, I have to write myself through it, but dropping the endless layers of critical refraction that I'm used to dealing with for an academic piece. So if I'm writing, I'll use this Gold Coast objectivity example, I am engaging with hardcore Guineanists who will take me to task for not having minute understandings of how different Akan polities split from each other in the 19th century. And it's like, that's not what I work on, right? But I have to do that reading. I will be dealing with Africanists who are interested in how the Gold Coast fits into larger disciplinary conversations about African history. I'll be dealing with a generalist audience from the literature end of things. And then I'll be dealing with Victorianists who say, oh, well, have you referenced, Mary Poovey in thinking about the Gold Coast? So you've got all of these conversations together that have their own decades of kind of sediment. And you have to spend months and months figuring out what's valuable about them, what needs to be appeased, what can be sort of read and digested and then ultimately put to the side. And frankly, just none of that is immediately relevant if I'm writing a piece for N+1 or Popula or what have you. It has to be kind of getting back to the source. There's this really cheesy scene in an incredibly cheesy movie, and I'm going to give myself away even more than Liam Neeson did, called Center Stage. Former ballet dancers, what can I say? I've seen all the terrible ballet movies. And Zoe Saldana, a young Zoe Saldana, is like twirling around being really fancy. And her teacher, the Broadway legend Donna Murphy, comes in and she pats the bar. And she goes, stop with all of the pyrotechnics, right? Like, we're not doing the Bolshoi here. And you need to get back to this. And it's like, oh, okay, just doing pliés at the bar. But it kind of feels like that when you're switching registers, where my home is a literary text, my home is sensitivity and feel to how a writer is moving between history and creativity or invention. And it's kind of stripping away all these layers of debate and just getting to the heart of the matter, if you will. And oftentimes that takes a lot of rewrites.
I just want to remind all the panelists, if you have questions, I think we're just taking those in the chat section. So please type them in. And I have a totally self-interested question to ask that hopefully is useful to other people as well. So I'm finishing my first academic book right now, but I also have a background in journalism. So I've written for a lot of public audiences, and I'm just more generally interested in public-facing work. And I'm curious how you see this kind of writing counted in the academy, maybe especially for people who are just leaving graduate school and just starting their careers, and how you've seen that change maybe over time, and how you see that changing in the future.
Yeah, that's one of the questions of the moment for a lot of us, I think. I just came through my own tenure evaluation. Like I've just come out the other side of it, and so it's something that I thought about a lot going through that process. You know, is anyone going to care about any of this? And I actually submitted it with my file. I saved at least the more substantive pieces, and I sent it out to my department, and I said, hey, you know, I'm cut out of the process at that point, so do with it what you will. I think that there are two extreme responses to this, and I'll start with those because I hold neither of them. One is that this stuff shouldn't count, that it's extra, and that it's diluting what we do as hardcore scholars. I don't agree with that. I think that there is huge merit, especially to a longer essay in a public forum, not least because it bypasses some of the truly glacial pace of academic publishing, and oftentimes it's glacial without having clear payoff, if you will. You're not getting serious editorial attention. It's really just a hugely backed up pipeline because it relies on so much voluntary labor, especially on the part of junior scholars. So you're able to put work out there faster and get really meaningful feedback faster, not least by or from other academics. Many academics that I'm now connected with, I didn't reach through, long essays theorizing regionalism in research in African literatures. I reached them especially through writing early in my career for a couple of South African public magazines. One was a sort of hot property for a while and again has now closed. So perhaps we can bracket conversation of how ephemeral some of the actual media are. But that was hugely valuable for me as a scholar, right? When I was living in Cape Town, but publishing mainly in American journals, I wanted to have a way of reaching an actual South African readership, and I did. So that meant a lot to me. The other extreme is that tweets should count for tenure. And I've literally seen that position. I also very much don't agree with that. And I know I'll accrue some haters probably for saying that. I think there really needs to be a middle ground, right? Where a public piece that demonstrates real attention to crafting, to argument, to all of that, but doesn't go through peer review necessarily of the same sort. I think absolutely that should count in the sense that there should be a place in tenure files for that. And I think more and more we're seeing key academic venues move in that direction. So Modernism Modernity, where I almost said work, but it's certainly not a job where I do work, is a great example of that. We see that in something like Post 45, at least in the literary field. Public Books is a little more to the sort of editorial end, shorter pieces, but definitely I think Sharon Marcus had a sort of crossover ideal in mind when she founded it. So that seems like a less controversial position more and more, and I think that's a really, really good thing. That said, I do also think that there needs to be some accountability to histories of terms and histories of conversation that you lose oftentimes, not on purpose, but just in the rapid fire nature of social media dialogue that should not be lost. And I think especially when we're dealing with really hot button issues of race, ethnicity, of gender, sort of highly topical social conundra, I think it becomes ever more important that we have generous accountability structures in play so that we don't kind of lump everything into terms that get retweeted easily and terms that retravel easily. I see a lot of first person plural in social media editorializing because it travels, right? It swells, we, our moment, all of that. And I think, well, the Xhosa writers writing about the 19th century, like Chaim Push, are going to be living in a different moment than you are writing from Connecticut, right, where I'm from, New Haven. And so I think that is a problem potentially in making certain kinds of discussion count for academic credit. I realize that's a little bit garbled, but I think there should be a nice happy medium. And then of course the challenge is figuring out precisely where that lies, which is a whole other can of worms.
Terrific. Let me, I want to do one quick follow-up, but also take a moment to tell the audience members who've gathered here that, that we are absolutely hoping that you'll contribute with questions, and I see that there is a raised hand. However, we don't have any way to have you ask that I'm aware of to ask the question live right now, other than typing the question into the chat box. And Jeanne-Marie can see the questions when they come in. So can Joseph, Becker, and myself. And I do hope some more questions. There's a very nice comment already in the chat box. I do hope some questions come in. In the meantime, Jeanne-Marie, I wanted to ask a follow-up and maybe even pose it a little bit in a kind of devil's advocate way here, because you've been eloquently arguing for this kind of middle ground, that we need a little bit of both worlds. We need to sort of parse the difference between these two extremes. And yet I hear in the details of your answers something that I would characterize as in some ways pulling towards the left, or pulling towards one side. And the suggestion that I'm going to make is a lot of in your examples, what really has come across is, on the one hand, yes, a kind of lip service towards complexity, the importance of a history of terms, of giving its due, disciplinary groundwork. But at the same time, you've characterized this also as endless layers of critical refraction, for example. And in your examples have really seemed to me to be making the case that one can do that work, have that as a base work, have done the real thinking that's required and disciplinary groundwork that's required for making these sorts of contributions, and yet still write in a way that in some ways doesn't get lost in those rabbit holes, but really makes clear thinking the groundwork. And this, to the extent that you are making this argument, I have to say it's one that I deeply and quite passionately feel is the case. I have found, going through the same kind of trajectory over many years that you've described as well, that going back and looking at my writing in the past and how it's changed, I found, and I still believe, that many of us in our respective disciplines use a certain terminological armature as a kind of crutch from time to time, as an excuse not to think through basic problems. And that when we make ourselves take that step back and explain exactly what we're saying, it's a lot harder work than we thought that we were getting into, right? And by doing that hard work, we're actually forcing ourselves to think more clearly. And that's sort of the pressure that I want to put on that very politic middle road that you've been taking.
That's me. Yeah, it's very fair. I hear you as saying that really achieved public writing, like really achieved scholarly writing, in a sense, needs to arrive at a point of having invisible scaffolding, where all the work is there, but it's kind of compressed, right? And it comes out in a sentence that's extremely carefully chosen, shaped, rather than 6 paragraphs charting your evolution. I think that's absolutely right. I certainly felt that in my second book. It was hugely liberating, frankly, to be able to write like that. I think the second book, it's almost out. It maybe has 4 pages of endnotes. That's it. And the first is, like long passages of Russian and Afrikaans and like every chapter. So certainly, as I became, I think, a better scholar and a better writer, that is what happened, is the process that you're describing. But the question is there any way to get there without sort of going through the more painful hoops, without sort of working yourself to that place? Are there chutes and ladders style shortcuts where one can be trained to do that in some sense right out of the gate? I don't know, frankly. I don't know that I could have been. And part of it was because I was managing quite a number of traditions, linguistic and otherwise. And there was a certain amount of ticking of boxes that needed to be demonstrably ticked, to show that I hadn't cheated in ways that have ethical stakes. Like if I'm writing about Ghana and I'm writing about Zimbabwe, but I'm not citing any Ghanaian or Zimbabwean scholars, if I'm reading the sort of distillations only, that's not going to work. And I wanted to show my peers, in some ways with the first book, it's an act of good faith, I think, that, hey, I'm in there with you, right? Like I'm doing this reading in this work, probably reading of things that I'll never go back to again in my life. But but you do want to demonstrate that you've taken that time. So, I mean, I think of myself kind of now, you know, Kwame Appiah is one of my great idols as a scholarly writer and academic. He has not responded to any of my scholarly fan mail, so I'm not sure what that says about me and my career. But his first monograph, was this kind of, frankly, pretty dry, boring book on language philosophy, where he was doing precisely this, right? And he talked about it in a podcast recently. It was 5 questions with philosophers, and said, yeah, you know, if I were a really hardcore analytic philosopher, like where I started out, I would have written a follow-up to that book and I would have pleased 15 diehards. I mean, I'm paraphrasing what he said, and I didn't do that. And he admitted, I actually am not sure that I could still do that. And writing books about identity, and writing even from In My Father's House onward, for those of you who know his career, was prioritizing a different kind of writing that, like you, Bill, I do think I now gravitate towards. But I don't want to go so far as to say that there wasn't something deeply and intrinsically valuable about, again, doing the hardcore, sort of walking people through the scholarly layers monograph that I was trained to do in the first instance. And I don't think for myself, I could have cut that out. I'm so happy to have a second book coming out that I think a lot more people will read, frankly. But I needed that sort of wind up exercise, right? To kind of write my way into getting there. So maybe it's a matter of pacing in our careers. Maybe it's a matter of thinking about growing an audience as we progress through an academic trajectory. And I prefer to think about it that way rather than sort of training to just jump into the sort of more distilled way of writing right from the beginning. Perhaps that's just because I didn't have it in me, but I think that a lot of people probably need time to get there.
No doubt. I think that the way that you phrase it is perfect. You know, having to pay our dues to do the kind of work that gets us into a position to then develop a craft that is more than just ephemeral. That's more than just that you know, that deals with issues, but deals with all of that background, all of that lattice work of information and thought within a critical practice that the you know, doing a PhD, writing a dissertation, writing first book entail. We do have some questions coming in. Joseph, do you want to, or Jeanne-Marie, choose? I see 2, and someone who is also expressing sympathy with not getting any answer from a PhD.
from Kwame Appiah. I even pulled out family connections at one point, you know, mentioned them casually.
Right.
Still nothing. So, you know, yeah, I see 2 questions. So I'll read. Should I read them out loud?
Yeah,
maybe?
let's do that. Yeah, perfect.
Hi, Mukti. So Mukti Mangaram, who is a colleague in my field, is a comparatist working in post-colonial traditions at Rutgers, says, like you, I am trying to write my second book to be more accessible than my first. Any tips on how you tried to achieve this? Oh my God, yeah, this is a topic very close to my heart. A lot of it also was rewriting, writing and rewriting, just kind of, I don't even mean a full draft. I mean, just compulsively as I was going, constantly stripping down multiple sentences into single sentences, and then groups of sentences into shorter and tighter paragraphs. I'm very much a sort of edit as I go person now. I think more than I was with the first book, where I had a full draft and then did rewrites. My second book was much more, when I actually had the full draft, it was almost done because I had spent so long with each sort of chapter section, getting these coils, you know, sort of pressed down a bit. A lot of it was be really detailed here, being extremely attentive to paragraph and section shape in a way that did come out of some of the N+1 writing in particular. And I mentioned that venue again, just because, again, there was this one editor who just did such a bang up job with that magazine, whose expertise I hugely benefited from. But I went through and I would read paragraphs of my second book out loud to myself and say, okay, can I get the gist of what I'm talking about in this section of the book from reading the first line of a paragraph and the last line of a paragraph? And if I couldn't, I would rewrite. And then I would go through and make sure that I pulled up after sections that couldn't help but be a little bit sticky. For example, there's a long discussion in a chapter on this Ugandan novel called Chintu about the difference in traditions of African philosophy between reason and rationality. So some pretty heady discussions of Apias, for example, of a South African philosopher named Ngobe Ramose, that are distinguishing reason from rationality in terms of the scale at which they operate in relation to their evidence. There's no way to write that in a hugely accessible fashion, right? You need to have a little bit of scholarly apparatus mixed in there. But I have these kind of chunks of distillatory prose at the end of basically every paragraph in that section that just sums up the gist, right? And says more or less, here's why this matters, even if you had to skip that whole preceding section. I also was a lot more free with inserting an I, a sort of subject position into the writing. I have mentioned in the past section that actually this is what I'm arguing, and then clarifying over and over again, here's what I'm not saying. And I did that especially on points that would seem to invite from a certain kind of reader, ungenerous reception. So there's some stuff about decolonization going back to people who were talking about it already in the 80s and 90s in African philosophical circles. And so I say over and over, here's what I'm not doing. Here's what I'm doing, right? And just make it abundantly clear in ways that could maybe strike some really hardcore academic readers as a little bit redundant, even a little bit grating. I think it's worth it in order to not have the least generous or, sort of lowest common denominator kinds of engagement with your book. And that's one thing that writing more accessibly can do, is sort of head silly disagreement off at the pass, so that you can hopefully invite the more substantive kinds of engagement and even disagreement. So I try to do that a lot. I would also say that I would explain at key points where I was and was not hoping to invite discipline-specific engagement. So for example, the second book is all about literature and philosophy. It's specifically about African literature and African philosophy. I am not trained as an analytic philosopher. Johns Hopkins philosophy is not going to be inviting me to speak, right, about my book. That is for absolute certain. I am trained in, again, comparative literature. And so in moments when I felt that I had to reference analytic philosophical debates to be responsible, I would say that's as far as I'm going to go with this. By all means, this is a controversial idea in circles that have treated it in more depth. But if you'll walk with me, we're going to move on a little bit more quickly. So things like that, signposting, being willing to sort of own the moments where you do want to cut things off, and being willing to explicitly invite engagement of certain sorts, rather than just throwing all of this academic prose out there and letting your reader work through it as a maze. That's kind of what I would say to that. Okay, second question from Alvaro says, thank you, Jeanne-Marie, for the 2 articles and your talk so far. And thanks to the panelists and the Institute for organizing this. I second that. One question that she has is about the format for public writing. So as an op-eds versus reviews versus essays, can you speak a bit more about what sorts of factors we should take into account when choosing one over the other? Yeah, that is a great, great question. I think I mentioned briefly at the beginning of my remarks, this difference between, for me, the operative difference is between writing in public as a literary critic versus writing, say, a commentary, right, on social issues, for example, or even on literary debates that end up becoming sort of debates of wider interest. So Charlie Hebdo, back some years ago, there was a scandal surrounding whether or not they should be honored by PEN America. I wrote a piece about that, again, I wouldn't, I think, right now, just because I'm a wimp when it comes to Twitter. But that sort of thing. The honest answer is that I think that you've got to have a really thick skin now to do the commentary stuff. And some people thrive on this, right? And hats off to them. I mean, I have friends, I have colleagues who are just prolific public writers and plugged into social media. I mean, I have friends from grad school who have tens of thousands of followers, and they will jump into anything and take it head on and invite whatever comes at them, and kudos to them. And I really mean that sincerely. I can't do it. I'm just not built that way, right? I'm an obsessive complexifier, you know, and I think that I learned sort of the hard way that I really only want to put myself out there on things that I am willing to like go to the mat for. And for me, that is literature. And it is sort of insisting on a distinction between really important literature and more epigon or fly-by-night literature. Like that I will fight to the death for, so to speak. On issues of sort of higher ed controversies, I'm just not going to do it. And there are people who have told me to my face, friends who mean well, who, you know, a good friend of mine is an editor at the Chronicle Review. And he's always trying to get me to write stuff for him based on private conversations. And I'm just like, no. It's, you know, I've got a toddler. I barely have an hour in the day as it is to sort of keep my wits about me. And I simply can't withstand the sort of commentary Twitterati venue. And so I choose my engagements based on that. And for me, it's a matter of, okay, what can I write that's going to invite readerly engagement from people who also care about literature? And it sounds deceptively simple, but it's not. And it's meant for me, as I said earlier, sort of picking and choosing more, say, literary public intellectual venues, and leaving the bigger institutional battles to people who I just think do a better job of it. So it's an exercise in humility, you might say, and it doesn't necessarily help my career. I could get a lot more followers and stuff, you know, maybe if I were more willing to engage in more regular combat. But it's something at the very least that I encourage my own graduate students and sort of younger scholars who I talk to a lot or mentor to just be aware of, to just say, okay, if I put this out there, this is going to be the likely kind of response or engagement. Do I want that? Am I ready for it? And the answer is going to vary from person to person. If you're writing for the Chronicle, everyone's going to read it, right? Everyone in higher ed, at least. And if you're writing for 3 a.m. magazine, you're going to get a very different audience. I get philosophers from France and from Ghana, people from all over the world, but they care about the philosophical kernels, not so much about what's happening this week in a particular set of institutions. So I hope that answers your question, at least to some degree. Yeah, you're welcome.
We have another question in the Q&A. Are you able to see that?
Yep.
Okay.
Okay, from Brad. I feel like I'm reading off sort of on a talk show here. Like Brad asks, you know, what's on your Christmas list this year? So he says, you've mentioned your training in comp lit and work in a smaller department and how that transfers into writing for broader audiences. Would you say that writing for the public is one way of resisting hyper-specialization, regardless of institutional training and positionality? That's a really good question. Yes and no. Bill is gonna say I'm being in the middle again, which I know I do tend to do that. I'm a very like on one hand, on the other hand sort of person. I mean, this is like my whole self. Yes, in the sense that I really deeply think that the stuff I'm writing about now, which like I said, is basically Gold Coast literary and intellectual history from this 10-year period in the 19th and early 20th century. I think it's so goddamn interesting that everyone should care about it. And so I wrote a piece for example, I think examples are helpful, about this Gold Coast intellectual named J.E. Casely Hayford, who Ghanaians all know because places are named after him. People in England are likely to know because the Casely Hayford family have become a very prominent sort of Black British cultural presence. One is a fashion designer, one is a sort of kind of academic who's a curator and works for the BBC. But Americans, for the most part, and even a lot of people who are interested in other African traditions don't know this name necessarily and don't know how important they have been. So I wrote a piece for Popula, which was a really fantastic venue for a while, but unfortunately seems to have lost its funding, which happens to sort of bold new online venues a lot. And it's something one also has to think about when choosing where to publish. I wrote a piece about Kofi Annan's death and about contextualizing Kofi Annan's huge reputation over the course of many years in a very specific Gold Coast intellectual and institutional tradition. There was a particular sort of genealogy of Fanti, which is a sub-ethnicity of the larger Akan ethnicity in Ghana, had founded these schools and sort of been really instrumental in bringing the Gold Coast to this grand Commonwealth audience. And so I thought that was a great opportunity, to resist specialization and to say, hey, Kofi Annan didn't come out of nowhere, So when you guys refer to his style and his poise and all these kind of cliches about Kofi Annan's life in New York when he was working for the UN, you were actually invoking a highly specific language and tradition. That said, I think you could also cast resistance to hyperspecialization there as a plea for it. Because I would never have read all of these guys, whose books are out of print, right? I had to have a rare books librarian, for example, track down a treatise for me to get full access to these people, books that only exist in 4 libraries in the world. If I hadn't, so to speak, hyper-specialized, if I hadn't taken comparatist training really as an ethics, to say, right, I have to go really deep before I go broad, then I would never have come onto this in the first place. And so I think that it's more about finding the place of that intersection or that crisscross where you can make specialist knowledge, make it operate in the really far-reaching ways that it often does intrinsically operate. So that's how I would ideally want to frame that. But obviously comparative literature is not doing so well institutionally, so I am in the minority, I think, on this position.
We probably have time for one more question. If anyone from the panel wants to pose one, if we have one from the larger audience. Yeah.
Sure. I'll ask a question that has been to a certain extent on my mind, and I'm sure on the minds of other colleagues and graduate students, which is how right now you've been talking, or recently you've been talking a lot about your second book. And I'm wondering how you have either, struggled and overcome this tendency, and especially in American publishing, right, to focus on the North Atlantic, and in particular, really on the United States, the UK, France, a little bit, maybe Germany a little bit, but basically nothing else, right? There's this hyper specialization in publishing, and even in publishing, whether it's more trade style academic books or whether it's publishing in certain magazines, that you as a scholar that does not focus on that specific geographical area has to do kind of extra work to make your writing kind of appealing. And how have you negotiated that? How have you maybe some assumptions that you've kind of uncovered and are trying to challenge things? I want you to talk a little bit about that publishing struggle and from the publishing side of it.
Yeah, it's huge. Finding a publisher for my first book, which was really, I had people say, oh, well, why don't you just drop the Russia part, drop the Afrikaans part, and just like write about South Africa as a global tradition. And I'm like, that is literally the opposite of the book. It's really tough. And, there are moments where I've felt resentful of it, where I'll think, God, if I, colleagues, and they deserve everything they have, to be clear, but, friends or colleagues from grad school, you write about Elena Ferrante or something, or an American writer, and you're like, there it goes. It's like hotcakes. And I'm like, pleading for people to pay attention to Kofi Annan, who's like this major figure. And it's doubly complicated when you're moving among and between different audiences, where I'll get taken to task by, honest friends and interlocutors who are Africa based, for not being local enough. And then I'm like, dude, do you realize how many times I had to pitch this, right? Or kind of sell this to be a kind of intermediary writer, perform that it is kind of a go-between or translating function. Yeah. So you're constantly between a rock and a hard place a little bit in that sense. For me, some of that work has been done by being more deliberate about saying, I'm not part of the commentariat, or I've heard it referred to as the Twitterati. I am a literary critic. And so what I see myself as doing is drawing out the intrinsic points of interest in style, in affect, right, in formal shaping that writers who happen to be from Fanti land or from Mashona land at various points in history have been really, really good at presenting. And I think that in my reading, I'm really interested in this Ghanaian writer named Martin Eglowobe. He's absolutely just an incredible short story craftsman. He's just a better writer than Ya Jaycee, who wrote Homegoing, right? And now Transcendent Kingdom, who's barely been to Ghana, right? I mean, she is an Alabama-based writer who comes from the Ghanaian diaspora. That's valuable. That does certain work. And by no means should people not read it. But I don't have to work hard to get myself to focus, right, on the Ghana-based short story writer, because he's a better technician, because he's not working so hard to do the culture thing. And so for me, it then becomes this kind of just insistence on saying, I want to get people to see this intrinsic sort of innovative, important quality. There's someone in this chat right now, Mpush Ntabeni, who's a Xhosa writer in South Africa, who wrote this just killer novel that I think should be published here. He's going to have to work his ass off to get it published here, right? Because it's very embedded in Xhosa tradition and history, but it's just significantly better than most of the South African stuff that's published abroad. So I guess in a way, my kind of elitism, frankly, about literature and about literary achievement just give me this dogged commitment, right? To focus on kind of the right stuff, the stuff that's going to have the most actual stylistic and philosophical or conceptual payoff to reading it. And that's how I pitch it to editors is, hey, I don't need to do special pleading, publish this because it's really cool to write about, a particular tradition within South Africa. I want you to publish this piece because what's happening in Zimbabwe right now is just really interesting. It's deeply engaged with both the benefits and the limitations of social media, for example, and you should publish it for that reason. So I don't know if that fully answers your question, but that's kind of the tactic I take. And you are often working against the grain because certain constellations and geographical configurations come into vogue and then they leave, and they come and they leave. But at the end of the day, South Africa is still going to be there, Zimbabwe is still going to be there, Ghana is still going to be there, to take my three main points of interest on the continent. And someone needs to be doing that work of saying, hey, right, these places exist apart from how they're packaged. And that's really, really important to acknowledge too, right? Not just that diaspora is something that's big right now, for example.
A quick question in the Q&A, the name of the short story writer, someone missed it. Can you repeat it for them?
Yeah, I'll write it right now. Hold on.
Okay, perfect. And I think that we need to wrap up here. Thank you so much for launching us on this series. I've been feverishly taking notes, and it's actually going to be incredibly helpful as I attempt to finish my book, which is due January. I just wanted to mention for everyone else on the call, the second talk is going to be Francois Furstenberg, who's a professor of history. That's going to be on Thursday, November 12th at noon. So I think you can just go to the AGHI website and sign up for that there. He is going to be talking about op-eds on university reopenings. So this should be a completely different take on public writing.
We'll send that announcement around again the way that we did with this one, and it'll be listed in the flyer for that week as well. And Jeanne-Marie, let me just echo Joseph's thanks. You did a great job kicking us off. It's going to be a hard act to follow.
Oh, thank you so much. I miss seeing you all in person.
We do
And
too.
thank you also to everyone who showed up and who watches this after the fact. I guess we'll be posting it.
That's right. Yeah. All right. Thanks, everybody. Good to
Thanks,
see you all.
everybody.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.